The trawlerman's hands were steady on the wheel of a ship that had no business being the target. HMS Edinburgh was a light cruiser, nearly 200 meters of British steel, screening a convoy of merchant vessels through water so cold that a man who went into it had minutes, not hours. It was the last day of April, 1942. The convoy was called QP-11, and it was already leaving the Kola Inlet behind, already thinking it had done the hard part. Below decks, sealed in a compartment most of the crew never saw the inside of, sat 93 wooden crates. Each one held gold bars, 465 of them, stamped and counted and loaded under guard in Murmansk, part of a debt one government was paying another for the machinery of survival. Tanks, aircraft, trucks. The Soviet Union was buying them with the one thing that never loses value in wartime, and Edinburgh was the ship chosen to carry it home. At 4:30 in the afternoon, a torpedo from the German submarine U-456 opened her hull below the waterline. The ship did not sink immediately. She fought for 2 more days, crippled, under tow, while German destroyers circled looking to finish what the submarine had started. On the 2nd of May, they did. A second torpedo broke her back. She rolled and went down stern first into water 800 feet deep, and she took men with her. The official toll was 58 sailors. Some were killed outright. Some went into water that stops a human heart in minutes and were never recovered. They are still there, not metaphorically, physically, inside the hull, in the compartments where they were standing when the ship rolled. That fact is the reason everything that comes after this is complicated. Edinburgh is not an abandoned wreck sitting empty on the seabed. It is a tomb with gold locked inside it. For nearly 40 years, nobody touched her. Not because nobody knew where she was. Her position was recorded, her cargo was documented on both sides of an ocean of Cold War silence. But because touching her raised a question neither government wanted to answer quickly. How do you recover a fortune from a grave without becoming the kind of people who rob graves? By 1981, the answer somebody found was stranger than either side expected. Not a lone diver with a grudge against the depths, not a private company moving in the dark. Built around one working rule. They would go in for the bullion room and nowhere else. And to understand why that rule had to be written down at all, you have to understand what almost never gets explained about this story. The legal fight to even get permission, and the diving problem that made touching this wreck one of the most physically dangerous salvage jobs ever attempted. Most retellings of Edinburgh stop at the treasure. Gold recovered, headline number, done. They skip the part where a government lawyer had to decide whether opening that hull was theft, salvage, or something that needed an entirely new category. They skip the part where a diver had minutes, not hours, minutes of usable time on the wreck per rotation, working at a depth where the human body becomes a liability the moment something goes wrong. That is the story worth telling properly. Not just what they found, how they were ever allowed to look, and what it cost the people who went down to check. By the spring of 1942, the Arctic convoy route between Britain and the Soviet port of Murmansk had already earned a reputation among the men who sailed it as the worst run of the war. Not because of any single battle, but because of the water itself. The Barents Sea in April is close enough to permanent daylight that a convoy has almost nowhere to hide, and close enough to freezing that survival time for a man overboard is measured in single digits. Add German aircraft flying from occupied Norway, German U-boats stationed along the route, and German surface raiders waiting for exactly this kind of target, and you have a corridor where escort ships like Edinburgh were doing 2 jobs at once, guarding merchant vessels and carrying cargo nobody wanted lost. The gold itself tells you how seriously both governments treated this debt. The Soviet Union was paying Britain in bullion for Lend-Lease adjacent war material, because gold could be verified, weighed, and trusted in a way that promises on paper could not, especially between 2 governments that trusted each other only as far as necessity forced them to. 93 crates, 465 bars, loaded aboard a warship instead of a merchant vessel, specifically because a warship had guns and armor a merchant ship did not. It did not matter enough. A German submarine's torpedo does not care what a ship is carrying, only where its hull is weakest. The first hit tore into Edinburgh's stern on the 30th of April and wrecked her steering. She could not maneuver. She could not properly defend herself. For the next 2 days, British destroyers tried to bring her home under tow, while German ships probed for a chance to finish her, and on the 2nd of May, they found it. 2 torpedoes from the destroyer Hermann Schoemann struck her, one of them detonating almost exactly where the first hit had already crippled her. The ship broke in 2. What happened to the crew in those final minutes is the part treasure stories tend to rush past. Men trapped below decks as compartments flooded. Men who made it into the freezing water and lasted only as long as their bodies could fight the cold, which for most of them was not long. 58 sailors did not come home. Survivors were pulled from the water by nearby ships, some of them barely alive themselves, and the wreck went down stern first to a resting place 800 feet below the surface, carrying both her dead and her cargo into the same silence. This is the fact that has to sit at the center of anything told about Edinburgh's gold. The ship is classified, by both nations who have a claim to her, as a war grave. Not a metaphor, a war grave, with the same legal and moral status as any cemetery, except that this one happens to also contain one of the largest gold shipments ever lost at sea. British law generally treats military wrecks with human remains as protected sites, off limits to disturbance, salvage, or exploration without explicit government sanction. That protection exists for an obvious reason. A wreck like this is where people died doing their jobs, and their families, in many cases, never got a body to bury. So when someone eventually proposed going back for the gold, the question was never really about depth, or technology, or cost. Those were solvable engineering problems. The real obstacle was moral and legal. Could any government justify authorizing strangers to cut into the resting place of 58 dead sailors for money, no matter how much money it was? And if the answer was yes, under what conditions could that possibly be considered acceptable rather than grotesque? It took nearly 4 decades for 2 governments to agree on an answer, and the answer they built was unusually specific for exactly that reason. By the late 1970s, both Britain and the Soviet Union had reasons to reconsider the gold sitting on the Barents Sea floor. Diving technology had caught up to depths that were previously the domain of submarines alone. And 2 governments deep in Cold War tension found, briefly, a rare shared interest. A fortune belonged to both of them, in disputed proportion, and neither could recover it alone without the other's political cooperation, since the wreck lay in international waters, but the moral and historical claim ran directly through both nations. The solution was a formal salvage agreement signed between the 2 governments, something closer to a treaty than a commercial contract. It set out, in advance, exactly how any recovered gold would be divided, roughly 2/3 to Britain and the remainder to the Soviet Union after costs, reflecting the original insurance and ownership arrangements from 1942. It authorized a private contractor to actually perform the dive, but only under government license and only within a defined physical boundary of the wreck. This detail is the part almost no retelling of this story bothers to explain, and it is the part that makes Edinburgh genuinely unusual in the history of shipwreck salvage. Normally, disturbing a war grave for profit is not just frowned upon, it is the kind of act maritime law and public opinion treat as closer to grave robbing than archaeology. The agreement got around this by drawing an extremely literal line through the ship. One zone, the bullion room, where the gold was stored, physically separated by structure from crew accommodation. Divers were licensed to cut into that zone and that zone only. The other zone? Anywhere crew remains might be, which was declared entirely off limits. No exploration, no filming, no entry, regardless of what else might be down there. The operation was legally and morally structured so that the salvage crew were never, at any point, authorized to be treasure hunters inside a grave. They were bullion recovery specialists, working a single, sealed compartment that happened to sit inside a grave. This distinction mattered enormously to the divers themselves, many of whom later spoke about how seriously they treated the boundary, not because a contract told them to, but because they were entering a ship where people had died in exactly the kind of accident that could kill them too. The moral weight of the wreck was not an abstraction to the men descending toward it. It was the ship they were breathing compressed gas inside of, 400 feet past the point where sunlight means anything. The contractor chosen for the job was a specialist firm working with a converted support vessel called Stefanaterm, purpose-modified for one of the most demanding diving disciplines that existed, saturation diving at extreme depth, in near-freezing Arctic water, on a wreck nobody had rehearsed on because no wreck like it had ever been worked at this depth for a target this valuable. To understand what that actually meant for the men involved, you have to understand what saturation diving does to a human body, and why the operation could never simply send someone down with a tank and a flashlight. At 245 meters, roughly 800 feet, ordinary diving is not an option. The pressure at that depth is more than 25 times what it is at the surface, and if a diver simply descended and ascended the way a recreational diver does in shallow water, the dissolved gas in their blood would come out of solution the moment pressure dropped, the way bubbles rack out of a shaken soda can the instant it's opened. Inside a human body, that is not uncomfortable. It is often fatal. Saturation diving solves this by refusing to let the body ever fully decompress during the job. Divers lived for weeks at a time inside a pressurized chamber aboard Stephanotherm, held at a pressure roughly equivalent to the working depth, breathing a carefully mixed gas of helium and oxygen, because ordinary air becomes toxic under that kind of pressure. From that chamber, they transferred through a sealed hatch into a diving bell, itself pressurized to match, which was lowered on a cable through 800 feet of freezing black water directly to the wreck. Once at the bell, a diver would leave it through a moon pool, tethered by an umbilical carrying gas, communication, and heat, and work directly on the hull. And here is the number that tends to get lost in every retelling that focuses only on the gold. Actual working time on the wreck itself, per rotation, was measured in minutes, not hours. The transit down, the transit back to the bell, the cold, the narrow margin for error at that depth meant that a diver might get perhaps 20 to 30 minutes of genuinely productive cutting or clearing time before returning to the bell, and from the bell back to the chamber, where they would then live under pressure for weeks before a decompression process that itself took days, done slowly enough that the body could release its stored gas without forming the bubbles that cause decompression sickness, paralysis, or death. The actual physical task facing those divers was surgical, not brutal. Rather than tearing the wreck open, the plan called for cutting a precise opening into the side of the hull at the exact location of the bullion room, verified against the original ship's plans, avoiding the frame structure that could destabilize the wreck, and avoiding, absolutely, any accidental breach into the compartments where the crew's remains rested. Explosives were used sparingly and with extreme caution, shaped to open steel without triggering a wider collapse. Every cut was planned around a schematic, because a mistake at this depth was not something you could simply go back and correct with more time. Time was the one resource the entire operation did not have in any comfortable supply. The first bar of gold was recovered in September of 1981, and when it came up, verified and photographed, it became one of the most reported salvage stories in maritime history. Not because gold is rare, but because gold recovered under these conditions, from this specific wreck, under this specific moral arrangement, had never happened before. By the time the 1981 operation concluded, divers had recovered 431 of the 465 bars originally logged aboard Edinburgh in 1942. At the value gold commanded at the time, the haul was worth in the region of £43 million, a figure immediately split according to the treaty terms between the British and Soviet governments after the salvage contractor's costs and fee were deducted. It remains one of the largest and deepest bullion salvage operations ever completed. 34 bars were never found. They are still down there, somewhere inside or scattered near what remains of the bullion room, an unresolved fraction of the original cargo that nobody has been legally cleared to go back and search for exhaustively. A return expedition in 1986 recovered a small additional number of bars, tightening the gap slightly, but even after that second dive, gold from Edinburgh remains unaccounted for on the seabed to this day. That unresolved fraction is where the ethical conversation about this wreck actually gets interesting, because Edinburgh did not just recover gold, it set a template. Compare what happened here to what usually happens when treasure hunters find a war wreck, with no government sanction, no treaty, no boundary drawn around a grave. Those operations, when they happen, are almost universally condemned, and in many jurisdictions now illegal outright, precisely because they treat human remains as an obstacle to profit rather than a reason for restraint. Edinburgh is frequently cited in maritime law discussions, specifically because it demonstrates the opposite, that recovery from a grave can be conducted with genuine legal and moral structure if the parties with a legitimate claim build that structure deliberately, in advance, and enforce it strictly on the people doing the physical work. Today, HMS Edinburgh remains a protected military wreck. Diving on her without authorization is prohibited under UK law protecting military remains at sea, and the site is treated, formally and informally, exactly as it always should have been. A grave first, a story about gold second. The 34 bars still down there are not really the open question this story leaves behind. The open question is simpler than that, and it is the one worth sitting with. When a fortune and a grave occupy the exact same coordinates, is drawing a legal line around the money enough to make touching it right? Or does some ground stay owed to the dead, no matter how carefully anyone cuts around them?